I'm so happy to be here. The title of my book is For Small Creatures Such as We, Rituals for Finding Meaning in Our Unlikely World. And the first part of the title comes from a line in the novel Contact, which is the only work of fiction that my dad ever published. My dad was the astronomer and educator Carl Sagan, and he and my mom, Ann Druyan, who's a writer and producer and science communicator, collaborated on many books of nonfiction, essays, the television series Cosmos, but Contact was the only sci-fi, the only fiction that they wrote together, and they originally wanted it to be a movie. And as they started to develop it and hope to, go through the process of writing the script and getting a studio behind it and all those things, the process turned out to be much longer than they expected. And in the meantime, they wrote it as a novel. And as with everything that they created, they collaborated. And it was actually my mom who wrote the line that the title of my book comes from, which is, "For small creatures such as we, the vastness is bearable only through love." And that became kind of a family mantra for a philosophy that my parents communicated to me and to millions of other people. This idea that if we're tiny in an enormous universe, if we're here for the blink of an eye, and if the scientific method is the way that we try to discern reality from fiction, and the more information we have, the smaller we are in the grand scheme of things. Well, then, what do we have? What can keep us from falling down the existential crisis of that sense of panic that we can all feel when it's like, oh my goodness, we're so little, we're here for a second, the universe goes on in all directions, we're in this tiny, out-of-the-way planet. Well, what do we have? And the answer that they gave me was, we have one another, and we're together at this moment. And that filled me with a sense of real emotional fulfillment. The word spiritual has this sort of religious connotation, and I grew up in a very secular household where science was the pathway to understanding, and not just to, facts get kind of like maligned as like cold and hard, and like we have this relationship with provable things as though, well, we are either very blasé about them, or they're just sort of have this unpleasant connotation. But my parents raised me with this idea that the real provable elements of life were beautiful and stirring and could give us that sense of connection with one another, with our place in the grandeur. An example I often think of is like this idea of like, if you were to tell a small child, there is a secret code in your blood that connects you to your ancestors, to everyone who ever lived, to the earliest humans, to the first life on Earth, and whether you believe in it or not, it's there, and it can tell you who you're related to and how closely. If you have a couple great science teachers in school, you might get that sort of beautiful thrill of those moments. But so often the things that are, like DNA, so often the things that we learn at a young age are presented in this way where the wonder and awe gets taken away from it. And, the word spirituality has this religious connotation, but I think it also can describe that feeling that wells up in your chest when you have a deep understanding of our place in the universe or how we're connected. And so that's how I was raised, and I found it very fulfilling. But, secular humanism, or the scientific worldview, it's missing some of the elements of culture that human beings around the world and throughout time have relied on. There are not holidays, there are not recipes, there are not the rituals that sort of make up the rhythm of life. And the other thing that it's missing is a framework for how to deal with loss, with grief. And I lost my dad when I was 14. And this sort of sent me on a path to try to understand how can we come to terms with some of the changes that are part of human life without relying on the supernatural. And even though I grew up in a very secular household, we are also Jewish. And so some of the traditions that were passed down to me from my ancestors were still honored in our household. We still had Passover, but we had it in a very secular way. We still had Hanukkah. We still lit the yahrzeit candle, which is a candle that burns for 24 hours that you light on the anniversary of the death of someone you loved. And, you know, this combination of connecting with the traditions passed down to you, even if they were passed down by people whose theology does not match yours, but finding a way to do it in a secular style and still honor them is what really interested me. And so as I started to research holidays and traditions and rituals around the world, I noticed some parallels. So I'll read a little passage to you that addresses some of those. I'll preface this by saying my great-grandparents were not just Jewish, they were Orthodox. And when my grandfather, who was the first person in his family to go to college, came home one day from university, he had that like nagging feeling in his chest of like having to talk to his dad about something. And he gets into their home, very modest home in Queens in New York, and he finds his father davening, praying. He waits for him to finish, and he says, "Dad, I have to talk to you about something. I'm not going to keep kosher anymore, and I'm not going to go to shul, and I'm not going to go to temple because I don't believe. I don't believe in God. I don't believe in any of the teachings that you and Mom have brought me up with." And his father looked up at him and said, "The only sin would be to pretend." And that sort of also became like a family mantra. And you know, those two events sort of put me on the road to this. My great-grandparents' beliefs gave shape to everything they did. I have different convictions than they, but I envy the way meaning infused their lives. Through my secular lens, I see a different meaning in their traditions. In a way, it's really science that's been inspiring rituals all along. Beneath the specifics of our beliefs, sacred texts, origin stories, and dogmas, we humans have been celebrating the same two things since the dawn of time: astronomy and biology. The changing of the seasons, the long summer days, the harvest, the endless winter nights, and the blossoming spring are all byproducts of how the Earth orbits the sun. The phases of the moon, which have dictated the timing of rituals since the dawn of civilization, are the result of how the moon orbits us. Birth, puberty, reproduction, and death are the biological processes of being human. Throughout the history of our species, these have been the miracles, for lack of a better word, that have given us meaning. They are real, tangible events upon which countless celebrations have been built, mirroring one another, even among societies who had no contact. As I see it, here we are on this rock that orbits a star in a quiet part of a spiral galaxy, somewhere in the great wide vastness of space and time. On our rock, these events, changes, and patterns have an enormous impact on us Earthlings. They are important to us. We have spent a lot of time trying to decode them, to manage our expectations, to predict what's coming, to grow, to thrive, to survive. No matter when or where on Earth we live, we humans tend to schedule our most important events around the same times. Sure, Christmas and Hanukkah often fall around the same week, but so does the Dongzhi festival in China, Umkose Wokwashama among the Zulu, Yalda in Iran, and Soyal among the Hopi of the American West. And it's not just certain times of the year, it's certain times of life, too. Every culture, from the Amish to the Maasai, has coming-of-age rituals that, at their core, are the same as any bar mitzvah, quinceañera, or sweet 16 you've ever been to. Not to mention the vast array of human ways to welcome a newborn, marry a couple, or honor the dead. Ecstatic joy to deepest sorrow, the heart of these rituals lies beyond belief. While our calendars have shifted and our climates have changed, politics and superstitions vary, somewhere in the depths of whatever you celebrate, there is very likely a kernel of some natural occurrence. We needn't resort to myth to get that spine-chilling thrill of being part of something grander than ourselves. Our vast universe provides us with enough profound and beautiful truths to live a spiritually fulfilling life. Nature is full of patterns, and we humans love finding them, creating them, repeating them. That's at the core of language, math, music, and even ritual, which is the repetition of words or actions deemed worthy of representing something bigger than ourselves. Some rituals are very private, some are very public. Some are so commonplace we don't even think of them as rituals. My view is that all over the world and across time, these are all a form of art, an elaborate performance or a secret poem, all vital in their ability to help us face the nature of time and change, life and death, and everything else we cannot control. So my hope is that this year, as we approach the holidays, whatever your family's background is or whatever your philosophy is, even the most devout people still have to make decisions about what they're going to emphasize and what they're going to let fall away. Whatever you're doing right now, your ancestors were doing it differently 1,000 years ago. And I think especially when you have young children and when you come together with a partner, you have to make these decisions about what are you going to do? What are you going to do for the sake of tradition? What are you going to do because it reflects your values? What are you going to do just because you love it and it brings you joy? And I think especially at this time of year, there's something very profound about the way that we navigate this. A friend and I were just talking about do you do Santa? And how do you do it? And can it be sort of like, when you see people dressed up for Halloween and you say, look, they're dressed up as witches or whatever, or you say, oh, that's really Santa, or this isn't. And is there a way to navigate these things where you're paying homage to what you loved growing up or what your parents taught you, but still putting forth the idea that really reflects what you believe? So I'll tell you, in our family, we have Jewish traditions on my side and Christian traditions on my husband's side, and we do a secular Hanukkah, and we do a sort of secular Christmas with my husband's grandparents. But what we also do is on the night of the winter solstice, not in a woo-woo way, but we just say, look, tomorrow the days are going to start getting longer again. We live in the northern hemisphere. The planet rotates on an axial tilt. It's about 23 degrees, and because of that, the length of days change. And it's been really cold, and it's been really dark, and that's hard. But tomorrow it's going to start getting better. And regardless of what you believe, it's going to happen. It requires no faith, and it's wonderful. And I think that alone is cause for celebration. And there's in so many of our celebrations, when we peel back the specifics of time and place, there is a real, tangible scientific phenomenon. Solstice, an equinox, a coming of age is a biological change. There's so much underneath that's provable and real that's worthy of celebration. And I think we can all find a way to do that, even if it feels very, cutting edge and new and strange. I think deep down, it's in a way the most traditional approach to celebration, because before any of the dogma or specifics of the present, we all were looking up at the night sky, trying to get a handle on where and when we are, and that's the root of so much of what we do. Thank you, and I'd love to take some questions.
Our son's name is Sagan after the values expressed in an essay that Carl Sagan talked a little bit.
So beautiful, thank you.
I texted my wife, I'm like, ooh, do you have any questions that we should ask? And she said, so her question was kind of funny. She said, what do you consider the most important lesson your parents taught you to be that you think should be passed down from generation to generation, and why? And I responded, well, she kind of answered that as the first thing she said. It's sort of the title of her book. So I'll ask that question, or if you already did, then like, what's the second most important?
Well, it's a great question, and I think that, yeah, I mean, the title of the book is definitely inspired by one. I don't know how I would necessarily rank them, but another one that I really find so powerful and something I think about a lot is this idea that in science, and as in life, we have to tolerate ambiguity. And this idea that sometimes we don't have an answer to a question. And there's this very strong urge. I mean, it could be something really, like the minutia of daily life, of you send a work email and you're waiting for the response, or these deep, profound philosophical questions. And that if we don't have enough evidence, if we don't have proof either way, that we have to keep that space open and tolerate that sometimes very uncomfortable feeling of not knowing what the answer is. And I'll tell you a very short story that's in my book. So besides my parents, the other adult who lived in our household growing up was named Maruha Farhe, and she was my nanny, and she was wonderful, and we loved each other. And she was very devout Roman Catholic. She had been a cloistered nun in the Andes Mountains, and she left the convent, but not because of a lack of faith. I go into it in the book, but I won't right now. But anyways, she was a true believer, and she didn't drive, so my mom and I would take her to church every Sunday and stuff like that, and her priest, Father Tony, would come to dinner sometimes. Anyways, I knew that what Maruha believed and what my parents believed were totally different, and I was kind of a little bit of a slightly morbid child, I would say. And one day I went to my parents and I was like, Maruha says that when you die, you're in God with heaven, and you guys say that it's like you're asleep forever without dreaming. Who's right? And my parents, in unison, joyfully said, nobody knows. And that was so revelatory for me, because it was if we don't have an answer to this question, we're not going to just put something there, because it's so painful sometimes to just have this open space. And I think that's something that really stayed with me and was so valuable, and something that I still think about all the time. So I hope that answered you. I hope you can relay that to your wife. Thank you so much. That's a great question. Please thank her for me.
So one of the stronger things with tradition is not only that you do it in your family, but it's shared among the community. No matter where you go within your community, rituals are the same. How do you do the same thing in the secular science world, where it's totally new?
That's a great point. And I think identity and that feeling of belonging in a group is so ancient and so important. And I would say that I think the more that we look at the roots of so many of our rituals, we can find that connection when we go somewhere else. And it's not the same, but it's also not the same when you travel to a different city. And there might be a different country or a different community. There's always variation. And I think that the reason that we have rituals is because my mother always says there's no refuge from change in the cosmos. We're trying to process change all the time. These entrances and exits in life, the changing of the seasons, all this stuff. And we're trying to find a rhythm that we have to create for ourselves. And sometimes, in many cases, the infrastructure historically has been religious. But I think more and more you see people creating it for themselves in these secular ways that, maybe don't seem like they're religious, but if you get, or don't seem like rituals, but if you get together with your friends, or you have some community thing that you do every week, or you go every Thursday night to the bar with your friends after work, something like that, those are these markers of time. And I think that even if you're sort of approaching them in a secular way, if you feel connected to some ritual that your great-grandparents did or your grandparents taught you, and you go to a different place, you can still find that, and you can still find that connection to them. But maybe the parts of it that you emphasize are different than the parts of it that they emphasized.
I can think of a handful of other authors and secular humanist thinkers who have struggled with this idea of a missing cultural portion to secular humanism. Do you find inspiration, or have you seen other people who have answered this question similarly, or that you think have done a good job in filling that gap?
I think that often what happens, when there's a big change, the pendulum has to swing very far. And I think there can be a tendency to sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater sometimes. And I think as time goes on, we may come to a place where we think, okay, there's some of this stuff that's really valuable to us, and there's some of this stuff that doesn't stand up, and we're going to let it fall away. But there are a lot of writers that I admire who write about this kind of thing. Alonzo Botan has the School of Life in London, which has a kind of interesting parallel where it's this place where people get together and talk about these deep philosophical questions, but not in a religious context. And I think there's something there. And I think that you find more and more, there's so many private women's clubs that are sort of shared workspaces, but also there are lectures that are sort of popping up all over that have this element to them too, while not explicitly secular or opposed to religious, one way or the other. It's still creating this sense of community where people get together, and even book clubs and all these things that people create for themselves, where they're asking intellectual questions, philosophical questions, but it sort of seems to be on an upswing right now. I think that there's a correlation between that and people becoming less religious, but still needing that sense of community and that sense of regular, steady place to go. So I think that it's very interesting to see that, and I think that I've seen a lot of discussion about this idea that, it's if you reject some elements, it doesn't necessarily mean that every element needs to go. But yeah, there's definitely some interesting discussions about that.
I know you said that you and your family have some religious background and also some secular background. What are some of the aspects of each that you find most meaningful in your life? Like, is there something about being, coming from a Jewish tradition that you find particularly meaningful for you or your family? Yeah,
absolutely. After 2 or 3 generations back, the only thing I know about my ancestors is that they were Jewish. I don't know their names beyond a certain point. I don't know what villages they came from beyond a certain point, but I know that thing. And so, every year my husband and I have a secular Passover Seder, and the traditional Seder is very theistic, but there are lots of versions of ways you could, where the emphasis of the story becomes okay, if this is a story about, people escaping slavery and oppression and finding freedom, then, that becomes a story about, well, right now people are still oppressed and enslaved metaphorically and literally by, oppression, poverty, racism, all these things. And so it becomes this call to action of well, what are we going to do to make things better and more just? And I think having that and having something specifically, the springtime holidays are so wrapped up in the nature of what spring is, right? There is this theme, and you see it in Easter too, of wow, that was really close. That was almost so bad, but I think it's going to be okay, And it's that's what spring is. And for eons, we didn't know if we were going to make it through the winter, if everybody in your group, in your tribe was going to survive. And when you got to that point where it was like, okay, looks like the weather's better and food is going to be plentiful again, that was intrinsically worthy of celebration. And I think there's something about that you see in the religious traditions around the world, that have a spring equinox, close to a spring equinox holiday. And so, yeah, there's stuff like that I really love and connect to. But then there's stuff that we've just sort of made up because it was right for us and we love it and it's fun. And, and I think that every family is doing that on some level, whether you're explicitly talking about it or not.
So this is kind of a vague, open-ended question. So first of all, it's really interesting that you said that Contact was originally supposed to be a movie before it was a book.
Yeah.
As is so often the case. I mean, I love the movie. I think the book was better. But what really got me about the book was first of all, that it seemed like the most intelligent discussion I've read of science and religion.
Yeah.
And I chose and not versus, but it's kind of the science versus religion debate kind of wrapped up in the story. And I just thought that was, especially whenever I was in the 80s, I was a teenager when it came out. I don't remember when the book came out, but I thought it was really cool. But then, at the end of the book, right, in the epilogue, right, the computer, the Argos computer discovers, way deep in pi, this circle expressed in like base 11 or whatever they said. And, he wrote, like, the circle means that the universe was put here on purpose, right? At the end of that story, the conclusion is that they basically prove that the universe was created on purpose, which I just thought was a really interesting way for a scientist like Carl Sagan to end that book. And I just wonder what you can say about that.
Oh, I'm going to have to ask my mom. That is a really interesting. I think I have to I think that is a question for my mom, who would be able to answer that much more deeply and was much more. That book came out when I was a very small child, and I've read it and revisited it. But they worked on, as they did with everything. She was like very deeply involved in every step of that, and she could give you a much more. I'm going to ask her. I can't wait to find out. I'll find a way to get you that answer. That's a great question.
You talked a little bit about changing traditions over time.
Yeah.
Have you thought at all about how we can? I see a lot of value in my partner works in museums. I see a lot of value in preserving things over generations, and sort of aside from sort of passing these things down as if you move to more of a secular world perspective, how do we preserve these traditions in a way that is meaningful and in a way that they can be shared with other people? Google thinks a lot about universality of information.
Yes, that's a really good question, and I think a lot about Greek mythology is something that we're all obliged to learn in school, and it's so much in our language today. So many gods are preserved in the names of space missions and sneaker companies and things, and it's like, here is this religious tradition that, as far as I know, has no devotees left, but are there any people who believe in Zeus? Do we really?
Yeah.
You really? Oh, okay. I didn't know that. That's amazing. Okay, but a much smaller group than they had around 400 BCE, and it's still so much part of our language and ideas. And I was totally obsessed with Greek mythology, and when I was a kid, I know lots of other kids who had different, areas of, mythological histories that they were fascinated with, and they sort of carried on in this way. And I agree with you, when, you go to a museum and you see, sometimes we're so removed from the idea that these were religions and that people really believed this when you see, Osiris, or on a tomb, and I think that the ways in which we preserve these things, I think it makes it won't. The things that we're currently starting to maybe let go of, the ways in which we find to preserve them, I think it sort of will make it easier to let go in certain ways, because it's very hard to feel like you're the last person in your lineage to do the thing that everyone's been doing. But if we can find a way that preserves this, where it's something that either it's like can be witnessed maybe in some virtual way for generations to come, even if people aren't participating in it the same way, I think that that's a really deep, good question, and something that is really powerful in terms of what an effect that may have on the way people start to change. It's a really good question.
I suppose in some respects you've already answered this by the way that you were talking in that last thing, but have you looked into the modern pagan traditions and polytheist traditions much?
Yes, okay, I see. Yes. Yes, in terms of the question of do people still believe in Zeus, I'm sort of meant continuously since that time, but in terms of a sort of renaissance of those elements, yeah, I have read to some degree of that, and there certainly is an overlap between some of the stuff that is in the modern pagan culture and what I'm talking about. But that's, I think there's an element of that still connects to some stuff that's sort of supernatural, that is a little bit different, unless I'm misinformed, or say maybe, that is a little bit different than what my area of focus is. Is that fair? I mean, tell me, you may know much more about this than I do. Tell me.
I have some friends, but I think that it varies a lot, is my impression. So there's some people who have a pagan tradition which doesn't have any belief in the supernatural and more use it as a focus for self-reflection and inner thought. And then there's other people who believe that there's some sort of like embodied concept sort of thing, and then there's some people who literally believe in the legends.
As with any religion, there are those three groups. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Well, I mean, if there's like a specific like book or something that you recommend, I'm always like open. I want to hear recommendations for learning. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're right, there is some overlap there, but it does sort of, it seems to be a tradition that is not emphasizing the scientific elements as much.
It is definitely a different language.
Yes, that's fair.
Even if it is talking about the same things.
That's a good point, and maybe that's something that it's worth me having a discussion with some people who are more involved in that. It's a really good point.
If you look at society from a technology standpoint, we've kind of grown too fast in ways over the recent decades. I feel like that in some way also applies to what you're talking about. Like, as we get overwhelmed with information, social media, whatever it is, I feel like our understanding of the world is completely down, right? Like everything else is telling us we know more, you can do more, but at the same time they're telling you have to do more. And I feel like that disconnects us more with everything. I think we have less tangible understanding of anything now than we did before. Is the like rapid growth that we've been seeing, is that also affecting our understanding of, I don't know, like spirituality? Like your kind of less codified version of spirituality. Like, I would have to imagine that the more we get sucked into social media, the less understanding. We don't even look at the stars half the time.
Oh, yeah.
How does that impact our ability to adapt? Let's say, for the sake of argument, we're letting go of some religions and taking something else for life, right? Like using something else to satisfy that need. Are we growing so fast that we can't find things that are tangible enough to replace that?
That's a really good question. I would argue that it starts almost with like the Industrial Revolution and like moving into cities and not being in your, leaving your community and all these things. The question though about the relationship between technology and spirituality is such a good one. And actually a friend of mine, I don't know if you know, Greg Epstein, he's the secular humanist chaplain at MIT and Harvard, and he has a column in TechCrunch about how technology is a kind of religion in a way, and how it has I mean, right, even the language of like followers, you know, on social media is like so explicit in its parallels to this. And, you know, there are certain ways, and I mean, and the idea, you know, these promises that historically have been religious that technology has provided, like, I mean, in a form of, you know, somebody dies, you can still see them. It's like a ghost, you know, and for most of human history, that wasn't possible. There are all these ways in which technology has provided, has made good on promises that historically religion has made and maybe not been able to deliver. And so I think there is something there that is really deep and profound question that there is a parallel there. But there's also this other way in which technology, I think, has made our lives sort of more traditional, because it's like, you know, we used to live in tribes where everybody knew what everybody was doing all the time. And then we moved to cities and we were so removed from everyone. And now we all know what everyone's doing all the time in this way. And like, you know, I grew up with my best friends and they're still my best friends. And we're together in this way, even though we live all over this continent, that we would never have been without technology. When we see each other and speak to each other every day. And that's the way we would have lived in a village until very recently. And so I think there's a lot in there. But yes, I think that it's true. I mean, this is a very big change in our culture, and I think there is a parallel to the philosophical and spiritual changes that people are having too. It's a really good, big question.
I have a quick follow-up if anyone else.
Yeah.
Do you have any particular, like you mentioned rituals and habits, daily things, something like a day where you just unplug?
This like idea of like, you know, Shabbat, where you are unconnected to the outside world and to like electricity and all these things. And I think, you know, the prevalence and popularity of like meditation and mindfulness, which, I mean, meditation comes from a religious tradition but has taken on this totally secular life of its own, is because people do crave that, and I think that's totally related to this. And I think it's like anything, like I was saying, the pendulum has to swing, right? You go all the way in one direction, you're gonna have to get to a place where you come back to a more even middle. That's a good question. I think it's up to the individual, and I think it's up to the particular event, you know what I mean? And like, I think there's a way to do it that's not necessarily heavy-handed, but still celebrates the real information that we have. And that, you know, I talk about in the book, like when I was a kid, like the best thing that I could do in my parents' eyes was to ask a question to which they did not know the answer, and that we have to, in those days, go look it up in the Encyclopedia Britannica, because we did not have the wonderful thing that you all make. And so, and like, you know, that became like a ritual, this idea of like, getting more information and finding out more, and then you would get like, oh, well, what's that? And what does this word mean? And what's this person I've never heard of? And then you follow the thread to something else. And that is like explicitly like more understanding, you know. But then there are other things that, you know, if you're having a party or you're having an event because like it's December and you live in the Northern Hemisphere and it's cold and dark and you need some like merriment, you don't have to like go into the axial tilt. You know what I mean? That's up to you. You know, I would argue for not making it too, you know, heavy-handed. But I think that there's something there where it's like finding the root of what you're doing and why, and not just going through the motions because you feel obliged, and actually finding out, well, what is this about and why are we doing it? And especially if you have like small children and you want to explain, what's going on here. I think that there's a way to do it where it's the through line, but it doesn't rob us of the sort of sense of festivity and pleasure that we all crave.
I'm curious if you put much thought into how to use these sorts of rituals to build a wider community. I mean, I know that you said that you see, your interactions with people that are, across the country as very much similar to a small village life, but there is definitely something to being with people in person that you can't really get through chat platforms and social media.
Yes, I completely agree. And like I do talk about like when I lived in New York most of my adult life, and I would have a monthly dinner, and that was, I didn't start out as like, I'm going to start this whole thing that's going to, be like, that I'm going to become really like dogmatic about planning and all this stuff. But it became this thing that was really important to me and my friends. And we really, people made connections and friendships and worked together and all these things that were born out of it. And yeah, I think that you're absolutely right that the in-person dynamic there, I think we are very removed from it, and that's something that I write this in the book. It's for me, one of the hardest things about being secular is you have to really work to congregate, and that is really something that we're missing. And I think you do see stuff popping up that sort of fills that. I mean, there are secular sort of quasi-church things that you see, or very, very reformed, churches that are almost secular, that you see, especially in large cities. And, like I said, like different clubs that people are members of, sports, things like that people do. But I think that you're right. I think that there is still something kind of missing in the culture that gives us that feeling of like, well, we're in it together, and we're gonna see each other, even when we don't really feel like it. You know what I mean? Like on like a birthday party or something like that. And I think for me, one of the really useful and positive elements of that is like a version of that is like volunteering, and like and it serves the same purpose in this way that like, okay, that's the thing I admire most about religion is the social pressure to do good works, and it's like if you go somewhere and volunteer every week or whenever you can, you see the same people, you share some value probably if you're all there together, and you're working towards something, and you build these relationships over time. And so I think that can be an element of that. But yeah, I agree. There is something that we haven't quite figured out in secular life to fill that void.
I haven't read your book as well. So
that's fine.
I'm curious.
No pressure, guys.
Coming from an Eastern tradition,
Yeah.
We haven't had that much of a two cultures kind of distinction between science and religion.
Yeah.
And the two have been much more intertwined, including non-theistic traditions have been very much a part of Eastern religion. Do you talk about that in any way in your book, or do you address that?
Specifically the idea that this is a Western problem, because I agree with you. I mean, that is a totally valid point. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and do you talk about how the two have coexisted, including non-theistic and theistic traditions have coexisted in sort of Eastern philosophy?
Yes, I mean, I think there are definitely there are elements of that, and there are elements of holidays and traditions that started out as religious and sort of transformed into something that's more cultural. I mean, I think, and this is something that's been totally co-opted in the West, but something like yoga, which is like a very widespread popular thing that, you know, comes out of a religious tradition but now has taken on a totally other secular, sort of maybe philosophical but not religious life. Yes, that is something that is a really good point. And, you know, I think you're right, this idea that it is a more of a Western problem, that the idea that there is this friction between these two things rather than there being some more openness to overlapping. Thank you so much. Thank you.